Shadi, thank you for doing this. Kitty mentioned that Shadi, of course, is a great scholar at the Brookings Institution. His most notable achievement in life is that he's a contributing writer for The Atlantic.
That's right.
Which means that he's a genius. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
The thunder is starting because we're talking about the Middle East. We'll hit some specific issues, Saudi Arabia and Yemen and the Muslim Brotherhood and what Iran wants, and of course the Israel-Hamas war of a few weeks ago. But I think we should lift up as high as we can and even expand it beyond the Middle East. And let me start by asking you this. Why is the Middle East a multi-decade source of woe for president after president after president? Every president comes in thinking, I'm going to pivot to Asia, I'm going to ignore it, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and then everybody gets pulled. It's like The Godfather. They just, when you thought you were out, they pull you back in, right? So what is it about the Middle East that turns it into a swamp for American interests? And has there been a president in the modern era who's figured out how to manage this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I didn't realize that we would be the last session, and I think it makes sense to save the Middle East until best for last. Let's
before
say
the
that.
drinking. Yes.
Exactly. So I think we're at a point now where a lot of Americans have, in a way, given up on the Middle East, or they don't want to pay too much attention to it, and I think a lot of people want to move on, including the Biden administration. I would say Biden sees the Middle East mostly as a nuisance to be avoided, not something to really focus on. He wants to pivot away from the Middle East, just like Obama tried to pivot away from the Middle East. But I think there's a lesson here that it is really hard to pivot away from the Middle East. The Middle East matters even if you don't care about the Middle East, because the Middle East has these ripple effects that spread throughout the world, and you can't really avoid them. So just to give an example, Russia and China are major competitors right now, and Biden has really emphasized that the central struggle of the coming era will be between the US and China, right? Well, one area that China is really trying to make a play for influence is in the Middle East. So if we want to fight or counter China, then we have to care about the Middle East, because some of it is going to happen there. Another way of looking at it is, I've actually made the argument before. It's a complex argument that might sound a little bit outlandish. I'll just mention it. But I have said that if it wasn't for the Syrian civil war and its spillover effects, Donald Trump wouldn't have been elected in 2016. I don't remember if I wrote that in The Atlantic or not.
I would have remembered that.
Yeah,
no, I
but I definitely wrote it somewhere. And part of the argument there is that the refugee crisis and the spillover effects from that caused a lot of second and third order effects that did affect American politics. You might recall that Donald Trump really did emphasize Muslim refugees coming from Syria and elsewhere, and he made that one of the centerpieces of his campaign. He got a lot of attention, the Muslim man, all of that, and he was really attacking Obama hard on some of these, what he would argue, profound mistakes that we made in the Middle East and ISIS. And he said something about, I think, Hillary Clinton being a co-founder of ISIS. The problem with Donald Trump quotes is that you can't always remember whether they're real or if you imagined, because they're just so absurd, right? Did he actually say that?
They're also all Mad Libs.
Yeah,
it doesn't really.
And then the second question, is there a president who's ever done a good job in the Middle East? My short answer would actually be no, at least not in the last 6 or 7 decades. There were times where we didn't focus as much on the Middle East, so just because we weren't doing anything, there may have been someone in, say, the 1800s who was good because they just weren't doing it, like Rutherford B. Hayes or something. But I actually have
the Hayes Doctrine.
The Hayes Doctrine.
The famous Hayes Doctrine.
Yeah, but I'll say something controversial because it can be fun to provoke.
It's
in
your
the last
nature
session.
also,
yeah. I actually have a little bit of a soft spot for George W. Bush, the second Bush, not the first. In other words, I was against the Iraq War, and that's one of the biggest blunders of recent memory. But when it comes to the Middle East, I think what George W. focused on that others haven't, he understood that the status quo is unsustainable, that if we keep on supporting authoritarian regimes that repress their own people, that is fundamentally contrary to the human spirit, to human nature. And authoritarian regimes can survive in the short to medium term. They can't last forever. I'm a big believer that authoritarian regimes are by definition temporary, because there is something about who we are as human beings where we want to have some say in our own government. We want to have some freedom in how we express ourselves. And it's just hard to repress people for decades and decades on end.
Let me just pivot to America's main foe in the Middle East, Iran, and note that it's 42 years of a temporary authoritarian regime. What accounts for their staying power, if that's the case?
Well, so what are the problematic things about talking about the long term is that how long is the long term, right? And that's one of, I think, the critiques of say, my position on this, that we all, in the long run, aspire to more democratic or more free government. And
as George W. Bush said, in the long run, we're all dead anyway.
Oh, that's a George W. quote?
Bush, yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
So Iran, look, I think that a problem with Iran is that, first of all, we as Americans have been obsessed with Iran, and specifically Iran's nuclear program. That would have never been, my preference. I've lived for about 8 or 9 years in the Middle East, and I don't remember anyone raising Iran's nuclear program as the #1 issue to address in the Middle East. It's important. It's important for national security. We have to take it seriously. But to make that the all-encompassing issue that Obama focused on, and George W. Bush sort of started this process of being very focused on Iran in the second half of his tenure. And I think that's distorted our policy, because if you see everything through that very narrow lens, you don't have a wide view. And so, for example, when Saudi Arabia was being a pretty bad ally and starting a war with Yemen during the end of Obama's second term, we didn't want to put too much pressure on Saudi Arabia to stop that, because Obama thought to himself, oh, well, we don't want to piss off the Saudis because we need them on the Iran deal. We have to get them to acquiesce because they're not really down with Iran. That's where we're going to use a lot of our political capital. So we can't also tell them to stop being terrible on Yemen. So at some basic level, you have choices, and if you choose to prioritize one thing, you're going to have to deprioritize something else. And this is, I think, the real challenge for Biden now, is what does he decide to focus more of his attention on?
Right. But wouldn't you say, and I noticed that you avoided my question, so I will.
Which one?
Why has it lasted so long? Why has the authoritarian regime lasted so long?
Well, so I think part of it is that we haven't had a good policy. And that
you think Americans can make a policy that can lead to the overthrow of the Iranian regime?
No, but I think we have in some ways empowered hardliners at various points where there could have been more promising thoughts. But look, I think that anytime, especially Trump. So Trump had the maximum pressure campaign, and some people like that. I'm not a fan of Iran. They've done very bad things throughout the region. They support mass killing in Syria on the part of the Assad regime. We should be familiar and obviously against all of that. But you can't. The maximum pressure approach hasn't actually led to a new movement coming from the grassroots up. That was one of the claims that Trump and Pompeo made. It hasn't worked out that way. And right now, we just had the recent election of a hardliner, Raisi, as president. So we see the hardliners coalescing and consolidating their power. Not to say that we're completely responsible for that, but I think that in some ways we've exacerbated some of these negative tendencies. But yes, some regimes can stay in power for a very long time. China, I think, is another good example of this. But there are other examples like Egypt and Tunisia. So we saw during the Arab Spring, right? I remember a couple months before the Arab Spring started, a professor friend told me that he had given some of his students a poll. What country do you think will face a mass uprising or revolution? And he gave them some options. I remember he told me 200 students answered that. 0 said Tunisia. But Tunisia was the first place where the Arab uprising started. It was on no one's radar. So for me, the lesson here is even if something seems very unlikely, there are countries, they may seem strong and stable on the surface, but there's a brittleness to them. And if we're not prepared for that as Americans, if we're not thinking ahead about the next uprising, the next revolution, I think we're going to be caught off guard, just like we were caught off guard in 2011 and 2012.
Since you've gone there, let's keep going there. Why did the Arab Spring, it's 10 years, why did it essentially fail? And was there something that we could have done to actually make it work?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, it's a very tragic story. So I was in Tahrir Square on February 11th, 2011, the day that Mubarak fell. Some of you might remember the euphoria and optimism that I think a lot of us as Americans had because we were watching these images 24/7 on various television stations, Al Jazeera, but also others. Everyone was covering this. We cared about this. And then we know what happened. There was a very dark turn. There was a military coup in Egypt that happened in 2013, which I sort of see as the beginning of the end of the Arab Spring or the end of the beginning, depending on how you want to view it. Couple factors. I think that the Obama administration cautiously supported the Arab Spring in the first few months, but then that didn't last when they started to see what the results were, when they started to see that democracy is challenging, democracy is messy. And I think that there was this idea that Egyptians or Tunisians or Syrians or whoever else, they would jump through all of the steps and get to democracy in a couple years. And because we had those expectations, when things didn't go well, I think there was a profound disillusion that we saw with the Obama administration and also with Americans more generally. And we started to withdraw support from these.
Specifically, it's when people started cycling through a Muslim Brotherhood phase, or a fundamentalist phase that freaked everyone out, and then
and I think so. So one of the big dilemmas we've had is that we as Americans, we like democracy in theory, but we don't like democracy's outcomes in practice. And by that I'm talking about it wasn't young secular liberals who did well in these elections during the Arab Spring. It was Islamist parties like the Muslim Brotherhood that won. In Tunisia, in Egypt, they did well in a number of other places, including Libya. So I think that made it harder for people like Barack Obama or Secretary Kerry. And for a book that I'm working on now, I've been going back to what senior policymakers were thinking at these and writing about and saying in retrospect to their fellow people in government and how they were approaching some of these issues. And there was a profound fear about Islamist parties coming to power, that we weren't really comfortable with that. Even Ann Patterson, the US ambassador in Egypt, early on, she said, I guess I should meet with the Muslim Brotherhood because they're rising in Egypt, but she said that she was, quote unquote, not yet comfortable with that. It took her a few more months to get comfortable with that. So I think we have to think about this fundamental issue, which isn't just in the Middle East, but throughout the world, is that the people that we like don't tend to win elections. So whether it's Duterte in the Philippines, Fidesz in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and this forces us to readjust how we understand the democratic idea. Democracy doesn't necessarily mean good outcomes that Americans like. We have to come to terms with the idea that there may be outcomes that Egyptians like that we disagree with. So for example, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or some other, like let's say nationalist party or anti-American or anti-Israel party, a lot of people in places like Egypt don't like Israel. If they have the right to vote, they might vote for parties that don't like Israel. We like Israel. We have a problem here. So we have to start thinking a little bit more seriously about how do we untangle that dilemma.
So from an American national security standpoint, it sounds like you could get behind the idea, at least in a kind of a realist way, of saying, you know what, we should de-emphasize pushing democracy and help shape the sort of more refined autocrats just to try to keep a semi-lid on things.
So Jeff knows that that's not my position. It's a good question. So it's a good way to push me on this.
I'm just fucking with them.
Yeah. I guess you're trolling me a little bit, which
Yeah.
I appreciate because I sometimes troll people in my Atlantic articles.
Sometimes. Yeah.
But so no, my preference would be that in the short term, democracy in the Middle East might undermine some of our interests, but we have to be willing to absorb some short-term costs for longer-term gain. Because if we look at the last 4 or 5 decades, we've been consistently, except for maybe 2004, 2005, and 2011, first with George W. during the Freedom Agenda, then maybe for 6 months with Obama. But for the rest of the time, we've been consistently supporting some of the most repressive regimes, not just in the region, but in the world. And we have to ask ourselves, has that actually made the Middle East more peaceful, more stable, more prosperous? For me, the answer is pretty clear, no. And we've seen how terrorism, violent extreme...
But hold on for 1 minute, because if Saudi Arabia, look, stipulating Saudi Arabia, not exactly a Vermont town meeting, I got it. But if Saudi Arabia were to flip, if the royal family were to be overthrown, it's not going to be replaced by liberal Democrats. It's going to be replaced by some pretty hardcore fundamentalists. Right now, Saudi Arabia is a repressive, non-revolutionary Muslim state, as opposed to Iran, which is a repressive, revolutionary Muslim state. So can you defend the proposition that the Saudi Arabia we have today is worse than a future state, Saudi Arabia, that is back to exporting some pretty dangerous revolutionary and fundamentalist ideas?
So I'm somewhere in between. I have to be realistic because I work in a think tank, so we're supposed to be somewhat realistic in how we see things. And I'm not going to call for us to. I don't think democracy overnight is what we should want in Saudi Arabia, because that's not realistic. They haven't even had elections. They haven't even taken some of the basic steps of having civil society organizations or any kind of open debate about what their political system should look like. Saudi Arabia is very, very authoritarian, especially under the current Crown Prince MBS or Mohammed bin Salman. What I think we can do as the U.S. is to put pressure on Saudi Arabia to be less repressive than it currently is, to start to move in a more positive direction. If they kill journalists, as we obviously saw several years ago, or when they crack down on women's rights activists, or when they don't allow even a kind of informal assembly that plays some advisory role to play more of a role, that's where we can start moving in a better direction. But we can do that by suspending some kinds of weapons sales. Saudi Arabia is close to 100% dependent on the U.S. for running their military. They wouldn't be able to run their aircraft because they would have to have fueling and logistical issues that we're instrumental in providing. We provide maintenance and spare parts and training. Theoretically, if American policymakers woke up tomorrow and said, we want to put serious pressure on Saudi Arabia, we could ground Saudi Arabia's Air Force. Now, that's not to say we should do that, but we have leverage. Saudi Arabia needs us more than we need them. Our imports from Saudi Arabia, oil imports, have gone down to zero for the first time in recent decades, just over the course of the past year, to actually, maybe not exactly zero, but almost zero. So that's where I think we can use that pressure and leverage. And also, there's a bigger question here about, do we as Americans want to stand for something? If we have this central struggle with China and other authoritarian regimes, are we distinctive from countries like China or Russia in the sense that we actually stand for values that I think most of us in this room feel some kind of emotional attachment to? That's always been at the center of what American power is, that we actually do care a little bit sometimes, not always, but at least we try to be better. We try to improve, and we should do that in domestic policy. I think we should also do that in foreign policy.
But if you went down, and I want to get to a couple of larger issues and then maybe take a couple of questions. But if you walked out of Brookings and went to the White House and said, guys, what you need to do right now with everything else that's going on is start putting maximum pressure on Saudi Arabia, they would say the same thing that the previous president and the president before him would say, which is, we don't need this headache. We have China, yes. By the way, I understand your point, but the world understands the difference between China and the U.S. without a Saudi example, without the example of U.S. putting pressure on Saudi Arabia. They would say, you know what? nothing good will come of this. We want to decouple ourselves from the Middle East as quickly as possible and focus on Asia and focus on European security and Russia and China. And by the way, the rest of the world as well, South America, Africa, and so on. So what would be the incentive for the United States to start pressuring the Saudis?
Well, let's take that premise then. If we're selling billions of dollars of advanced weaponry to Saudi Arabia, we're very involved as we speak right now. At the very least, if you don't want to pressure and get too involved with pushing Saudi Arabia in the right direction, let's at least distance ourselves from their repression, from their brutal war in Yemen, which has been a humanitarian catastrophe, by saying, let's sell you less weapons. Let's have less of this kind of very close military to military relationship with Saudi Arabia. So there is a way, if the idea is to lower our footprint in the Middle East and not be as involved, then let's not sell all these weapons. What do these countries do with these? Obviously, we're probably not going to go down to zero weapon sales, but Saudi Arabia spends a big chunk of its annual defense budget on American weapons. That's a big amount of money. So I think that, but the fact of the matter is that we're always going to be involved in the Middle East to some extent because the Middle East drags American presidents back in. So this idea that we can kind of wash our hands of the region, I think it's an appealing fantasy. In a perfect world, I'd maybe be sympathetic to it. But I think time and time again, we've seen that, and even just a couple days ago, the Biden administration just launched airstrikes against Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria. It keeps on happening. The Gaza conflict, just 2 months ago, we saw that reappearing. So this idea that we can just focus on everything else, I don't know if it's realistic. And I also would say that the last few decades, the idea of staying very close to these authoritarian regimes, it hasn't, so we didn't even talk much about terrorism, but let's not forget that over the course of the 2000s and the 2010s, terrorism and extremist violence was a dominant issue for us as Americans up until just a couple of years ago with ISIS. There's something fundamentally dysfunctional with the Middle East, and if that dysfunction keeps on appearing and reappearing, we may feel like, oh, it's not a huge deal now, but it might become a huge deal in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years.
So before we go to questions, and let's go to the issue you just raised. Yeah. But let's skip over all of the noise and anxiety of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. Answer this large question and do it in a minute if you can. How does it end? And how does the drama end?
Which drama?
The drama of the dispute between Jews and Arabs over the past 100 years in the Middle East. What does it look like? What is the end state? 20, 50, 100 years from now.
Okay,
you're running out of time.
Yeah,
Keep going.
I'll be very quick. But my hope is that we can find a path to a two-state solution.
But you don't really believe that a two-state solution would work?
I think that's still the most realistic option. A one-state binational option, I think, is a non-starter. It means that Israeli Jews would have to accept at some point living under other people's rule if Arabs become more of a demographic majority in those areas. So I just don't think that's what most Israeli Jews want, because the idea is that Israel is supposed to be a Jewish state. So then the only other we have two other alternatives. We two-state solution, but that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. There's a third that we don't really talk about, which is just an endless status quo, where things don't get better for the rest of our lives maybe. That for 20, 30 years, that this keeps on going on. We have periodic recurring wars in Gaza every 4 to 5 years. This keeps on happening. We see tremendous human toll, and people, and then, I mean, this idea that we as Americans, sometimes we think there's always a solution to a problem, but sometimes problems just stay being problems for a very long period. Now, I don't like that, because I don't think that's the moral, the humanitarian, and even strategically, I think it is a pain, as Biden found out recently, to have a war in Israel-Palestine every couple years. That's not something you want to deal with. So I think that we have to find ways to revive the two-state solution. But there's no willingness.
But you talked about the levers that the U.S. has over Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
it has even more levers to pull when it comes to Israel.
Yeah.
What would you recommend?
I support using at least some of our leverage to pressure Israel. That doesn't mean singling Israel out or sort of divorcing ourselves from Israel. Israel will always be a friend and an ally because of the history, and obviously their democracy, there are other Middle Eastern democracies. I don't like when people say, well, Israel's the only Middle East democracy. Tunisia. So
well,
I just want to
Iraq is more of a democracy.
Yeah, Iraq also can be considered, and Lebanon is one of the most messed up, flawed democracies in the world. So not a great example, but still. But I think that, yes, we have to pressure. Israel has a lot of the cards. It has a lot of the power. And unless you have the Israeli government making real compromises and concessions to the Palestinians, I don't see how you can close the gap. We can also encourage the Palestinians to make concessions, but generally speaking, the weakest party doesn't have a lot of concessions to offer the stronger party. So in that sense, I think the balance of power has to be addressed. And that's what we do with friends. If a friend is, indulging in policies that we think is perpetuating the conflict, we should say to our friends in Israel, hey, can you guys, let's think about... Stop being, you're not going to be perfect and no one is perfect, but be,
right.
Yeah.
I want to take some questions. I want the questions to be asked in the form of a question. And I'm invoking my power as a lifetime pass holder to say that I will cut you off if you start giving speeches. But is there anybody have anything on the Middle East or American foreign policy that they want to ask?
Taban, someone
over here.
Yeah, okay.
I'm trying to see if there's anyone over there.
Hi. Isn't the intense scrutiny of the Iranian nuclear situation, isn't it for the ability of Israel to survive? Isn't that the reason for the intense scrutiny? And then secondly, if you take your foot off the throat of Iran or the other regimes that want to get rid of Israel, what would the Middle East be without Israel?
Sorry, say that last part again.
What would the Middle East be without an Israel if Israel does get wiped off the face of the earth?
Yeah. So first of all, I don't think there's any realistic chance for the latter, that Israel has the strongest army in the Middle East. I can't imagine a scenario where these kind of, they're not impressive Arab regimes. They have more people, but they have some of the worst militaries. They can't really get their act together. I just don't think that there's really a real scenario where Israel actually is threatened with its existence. And if it was, the U.S. would guarantee its survival. And I actually support that. If in some kind of hypothetical situation you have some new power that's trying to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, U.S. should then stand in, because that's what we do with allies and friends. We prevent them from being destroyed, even if we have major differences with them. On Iran, yes, we don't want there to be a war between Israel and Iran, but if there was a war between Israel and Iran, Israel would be able to destroy Iran's capabilities pretty quickly. Israel is stronger than Iran. So in that sense, we want to prevent a war, but if a war did happen, Israel would be able to fend for itself pretty effectively against, and Iran doesn't want to have a direct fight with Israel because I think they know what would happen.
There's a question down here.
Thank you. You referred earlier to a two-state solution, and it's not realistic. I wonder whether it's possible for Israel and the West Bank, Palestinians in the West Bank, to agree on some type of two-state solution and separate the Gaza from that type of arrangement. Is it possible to do it separately?
You could, but then it wouldn't be a solution, because you'd still have an important part of the Palestinian territories that would be a constant problem. And I think Palestinians wouldn't accept a deal where both parts were not part of a solution, because, it would be a non-starter for any Palestinian leader to make peace with Israel just with the West Bank and say, well, forget about you guys in Gaza. That's hard to imagine. I do think a two-state solution is realistic. I just don't think it's realistic considering where the Biden administration is and where Bibi was, and even the new government is a little bit different, but still, there's no real will to have new creative ideas on Israel-Palestine.
But what about Hamas on the other side? I mean,
Yeah.
Hamas is the dominant Palestinian political party, and they're very frank in their description of what they want to have happen to Israel. So, I mean, are Palestinian politics as problematic for you as Israeli politics?
So this is the tough part, is that there has to be some way of addressing the Hamas puzzle, let's call it. If there are elections in Palestine, which there will presumably be eventually, Hamas is probably going to run. It may not win, but it probably will get at least second place. Then we're back to the 2006 situation. Hamas can't be eliminated because they have a big base of support, and they have networks throughout Gaza, the West Bank. If you can't eliminate them, then what is the alternative? There has to be some way to bring Hamas and neutralize them into a political process. For some people, that's a non-starter. If it is a non-starter, then I just don't know what the option is. But I think there has to be some way to basically get Hamas to agree to basically a two-state solution. And you do that by saying, hey, there can be a coalition government, which is what they were trying in 2006, 2007. So maybe the government wouldn't have Hamas members, because that wouldn't work for the US because of they're a terrorist organization. But you'd have technocrats in the government, but Hamas is still part, in some sense, of a national unity government. But I don't see how you can address the Palestinian problem without having some kind of resolution between the two major factions in Palestine, which is Fatah and Hamas. And that's been the major obstacle up until now, is that they can't actually find that resolution. So, and this could apply the same thing with the Taliban. Unfortunately, we can hate the Taliban and think they're terrible, but we couldn't eliminate the Taliban. So then you have to find a way to bring them into a peace process. That might be really uncomfortable, and it is very uncomfortable for us as Americans. But if you can't destroy the enemy, then that's who you make peace with, essentially.
If we could only design our enemies better, it would be fantastic.
Right.
I'm gonna take the last question. It's a question I always resent being asked this question, so I'm going to ask you. The question is there anything positive to say about the course and direction of Middle East history in recent years? Is there anything? The Syrian civil war has been one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes since World War II. Terrorism has not gone away, and so on. But is there anything that you see, studying it all day long, that gives you reason to think that tomorrow might be better than today?
Okay, let me try to think of something optimistic to say, because this is the last, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
The pandemic is waning.
Yeah, it is getting worse in some Arab countries, though.
There you go.
But okay, here's two optimistic things. First is, I know no one really cares about it, but Tunisia is doing, relative to the rest of the region, Tunisia is an example of a place that did have an uprising during the Arab Spring, and now they have a very flawed but functioning democracy where Islamist parties and secular parties are together in a coalition government.
So it's a good model.
It's a good model of people who hate each other being together in the government and finding a way to work things out peacefully, which is ultimately what democracy is about, people hating each other peacefully. That's what I would say, at least. And I think we'll have to do that in this country. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing now.
We should look to Tunisia.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is if you remember those images in the Arab Spring, that was a moment where you saw something beautiful happening, where people said, we are not going to live under these repressive regimes. We're not going to accept this. There was a basic dignity that you saw in people who were sacrificing their lives in Tahrir Square and other squares throughout the region. That, to me, and as someone who was actually there, and I guess you guys don't really know where I'm from. I'm born and raised in Pennsylvania, but I'm not like a white person, obviously. So my parents came from Egypt. So to kind of see how...
I always thought you were Jewish. Did I missed something?
Well, when I was in Israel last time, people would just speak to me in Hebrew. So, which is also a reminder that it is hard to tell the difference sometimes. So, which is good. It means that we're, anyway. But,
There's a moment of hope there, but then whatever.
Yeah. No, but there is something I think hopeful about people expressing, I think, an innate desire of dignity and freedom, which again, I'll go back to that, I think is a universal thing that all of us, regardless of culture or religion, people want to have a say in their own lives, in their own governments, and they want to choose their own leaders.
Well, next year in Tunisia. Thank you, Shadi.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.